The iron gate opened with a metallic scream that seemed to scrape the sky itself, a sound so sharp and final it felt like a warning that could never be unheard. Beyond it lay Auschwitz, vast and colorless, swallowed by an endless winter haze. Barbed wire stretched in every direction, coiled like something alive, humming faintly with electricity. Guard towers punctured the horizon, their silhouettes rigid and watchful. As Jakob stepped forward with the others, his boots sinking into frozen mud, he felt as though the world he had known only hours earlier had already slipped out of reach. The prisoners were pushed inward, herded by shouted commands and rifle butts. German words cracked through the air, harsh and clipped, followed by blows delivered without hesitation. Jakob clutched the thin sleeve of his sister Anya's coat whenever he could, though guards tore them apart almost immediately. Men to one side, women to another. Their eyes met only once before the crowd swallowed her, that single glance carving itself into Jacob's mind with a pain sharper than any strike. It was in that instant he realized how efficiently the camp severed not only families but the sense that one's life belonged to oneself at all. They were forced to stand in rows for hours, unmoving, while guards paced slowly, inspecting them like livestock. Snow drifted down, melting on bare heads and threadbare coats, then freezing again as the temperature dropped. Anyone who shifted, anyone who swayed too visibly from exhaustion, was dragged forward, struck, or made an example of. One older man collapsed without a sound. Jakob watched the guards pull the body away as if it were an inconvenience rather than a human being, and something inside him went unnaturally quiet. Roll call ended only when the guards decided it had. Time here was elastic, controlled at a whim. Jakob learned that waiting itself was a kind of punishment, one that worked invisibly, stretching nerves until they frayed. Hunger gnawed constantly, a dull ache that never faded. The first meal, a watery soup that tasted faintly of cabbage, did nothing to quiet it. Men drank greedily and still licked their empty bowls, ashamed and desperate all at once. Inside the barracks, Jakob encountered a new form of cruelty, one that did not require shouting or blows. The space was packed with bunks stacked 3 levels high, rough planks slick with grime. Bodies filled every inch. The air was thick with the sour smell of sickness and unwashed skin, a sourness that made breathing laborious. There was no privacy, no silence. Coughs echoed through the dark, punctuated by muffled sobs or whispered prayers spoken into splintered wood. By the next morning, Jakob understood that Auschwitz functioned with chilling precision. Prisoners were assigned labor details not based on skill but on the camp's appetite for exhaustion. Jakob was handed a stone, heavy and jagged, and ordered to carry it across the yard with dozens of others. On the opposite side, another guard shouted for the stones to be brought back. There was no purpose to the task. That was the point. Confusion was met with fists, slowness with kicks. The stone grew heavier with every step, not because its weight changed, but because Jacob's body was already beginning to fail. What stunned him most was how quickly pain blended into routine. Blows became expected, shouted insults background noise. The true torment lay in the unpredictability, never knowing when a guard might single him out, when punishment might descend for reasons he could not understand. Fear sharpened the senses and dulled them at the same time. Jakob found himself watching everything. The boots of guards, the tightening of their jaws, the subtle shifts of mood that might signal danger. Survival here meant constant vigilance, even when exhaustion begged for collapse. At night, the barracks buzzed with low murmurs. Stories circulated like contraband, warnings passed from mouth to mouth. Prisoners spoke of Block 11, the punishment block, in hushed tones. They said men were locked in cells so small they could not sit or lie down. They said screams were sometimes heard through the walls, and sometimes worse, the silence that followed. Jakob listened without asking questions. Knowledge here was double-edged, terrifying, but somehow preferable to ignorance. Torture, Jakob realized, did not always arrive dramatically. Often it seeped in slowly, disguised as order. Prisoners were denied rest, denied warmth, denied dignity in ways that accumulated until resistance felt impossible. Even bodily needs were controlled and punished. A man forced out of line to relieve himself could be beaten for leaving formation, then beaten again for soiling himself. The body became something shameful, something to be managed under threat. As days passed, Jakob felt parts of himself slipping away. The teacher who once stood before a classroom, explaining poetry and history, seemed distant, almost unreal. Words lost their weight. The camp demanded a different literacy, the ability to read cruelty, to understand silence, to obey without hesitation. And yet, beneath that forced obedience, something stubborn remained. A refusal to fully accept the logic of the place. A quiet insistence that what was happening was wrong, even if survival required pretending otherwise. He watched men help each other in small, dangerous ways, sharing a crust of bread, offering a whispered warning about a violent guard. These moments were fleeting and risky, but they pulsed with meaning. They reminded Jakob that despite the system designed to strip them of identity, they were still capable of choice, however limited. By the end of his first week, Jakob understood that Auschwitz's cruelty was not only in its punishments but in its design. Every rule, every routine, every calculated deprivation worked together to grind prisoners down. Torture here was not exceptional, it was embedded in daily life, normalized until suffering felt as inevitable as the barbed wire around them. Standing in line once more under a gray sky, muscles trembling, Jakob realized with a cold clarity that the camp's greatest weapon was not pain alone, but the relentless effort to make that pain feel endless. Jakob was dragged into Block 11 just before nightfall, his boots scraping uselessly against the stone floor as two guards hauled him by the arms. The corridor swallowed sound, its walls thick and damp, holding onto cold as if it were alive. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows that made the hallway seem longer than it was. Fear settled deep in Jacob's chest, not the sharp panic he had felt on arrival, but a heavier dread, born of knowing where he was and what this place represented to every prisoner in Auschwitz. The cell door slammed shut behind him with a brutal finality. Darkness pressed in at once, broken only by a thin line of light near the ceiling. The cell was so narrow Jakob could barely turn his head. This was one of the standing cells he had heard whispers about, designed so that several men could be crammed inside upright, deprived of air and rest. Within minutes, other prisoners were forced in with him, their bodies pressed together until breathing became a shared negotiation. Someone muttered a prayer, someone else whimpered softly before falling silent. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time dissolved in the darkness. Jacob's legs shook violently as he struggled to remain upright. Whenever one man's knees buckled, the rest had to support his weight or all would fall and risk punishment. Sweat soaked through Jacob's thin shirt despite the cold. The lack of air made every breath feel shallow and unsatisfying, as if his lungs could never quite open fully. Panic swelled, then ebbed, replaced by a dull, grinding endurance he had not known he possessed. When the door finally opened, the sudden rush of air nearly made Jakob collapse. Guards dragged the weakest men out first, their bodies hanging limp like discarded clothing. Jakob was shoved into another cell, slightly larger but no kinder. This one was empty except for a small opening in the ceiling and a concrete floor stained dark by years of suffering. The door closed again, plunging him into silence so complete it rang in his ears. This was isolation, a different flavor of torture, quieter but no less devastating. In the absence of sound, Jacob's thoughts grew louder. His mind replayed moments from his life with painful clarity, chalk dust on his fingers, the laughter of students arguing over history lessons, Anya teasing him for being too serious. Memory became both refuge and torment. Each recollection reminded him of what had been stolen, of how distant that world now seemed. He forced himself to breathe steadily, counting each inhale and exhale simply to anchor himself to something real. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly. There was no food here, no water. His body began to betray him in small ways, dizziness, trembling hands, a headache that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Jakob discovered that pain could flatten emotions, stripping fear of its sharp edges until it became something easier to endure. Worse than pain was the uncertainty. Not knowing when, or if, this would end allowed the mind to conjure endless possibilities, each darker than the last. From somewhere beyond the thick walls came sounds Jakob wished he could unhear. Shouted commands. Blunt impacts. A cry abruptly cut short. The courtyard of Block 11 was known among prisoners as the place for executions and beatings carried out publicly, not just to punish individuals but to educate the rest. Jakob understood now that even in isolation, he was never meant to be alone. Suffering here was communal, shared across walls and corridors, meant to seep into every corner of the camp. When Jakob was finally pulled from the cell, light burned his eyes. He had lost all sense of time, it might have been the next day or several days later. His legs barely held him as guards shoved him into the courtyard. Prisoners were lined up there already, forced to watch as a man was beaten for attempting to escape. Each blow landed with a sickening finality, the sound echoing against stone. Jakob could not look away. None of them could. This too was torture, to witness another's destruction, to understand that resistance, even desperation, led only to more suffering. The guards' faces revealed nothing. Their movements were practiced, almost bored. Jakob realized with horror that cruelty here was routine, procedural. There was no rage driving it, no momentary lapse of humanity. That absence made it worse. It meant the system was functioning exactly as intended. People were being broken not out of passion, but out of policy. Eventually, Jakob was shoved back toward the barracks, his punishment deemed sufficient. He stumbled more than walked, supported briefly by another prisoner who risked a beating simply by helping him. Inside, Jakob collapsed onto the wooden plank of a bunk. His body ached in unfamiliar ways, as if parts of him no longer quite fit together. Nearby, other men stared into space, their expressions hollow. Some asked no questions. They already knew. As night settled in, Jakob lay awake, replaying everything he had seen and felt. He understood now that Auschwitz's most horrific torture was never limited to a single cell or beating. It was the totality of the experience, the way fear followed you even after punishment ended, the way dignity was methodically removed until survival itself felt like complicity. The camp taught prisoners that pain was arbitrary, that innocence offered no protection, and that witnessing the suffering of others was unavoidable. And yet, in the darkness, Jakob whispered a poem to himself, the words barely audible. Each line was an act of defiance, however small. The Nazis could confine his body, starve it, exhaust it, and surround it with death, but they could not fully silence the inner voice that named what was happening for what it was. Torture, he understood, aimed to erase that voice. Survival meant keeping it alive, even when everything else was stripped away. As exhaustion finally claimed him, Jakob knew that tomorrow would bring more labor, more fear, more calculated cruelty. But he also knew he had passed through one of Auschwitz's deepest horrors and emerged still capable of remembering, still capable of bearing witness within himself. In a place designed to reduce human beings to shadows, that fragile awareness was not only resistance, it was proof that the machinery of torment had limits, even here.